In this lesson, we'll take a look at how to utilize external modules in order to create prototypes of our objects in our Corona projects. Within my project folder, I've created an images folder. That folder contains two different images of airplanes. One is intended to be a fighter. The other is intended to be an enemy airplane. The object here will be to create code that allows us to instantiate either the fighter airplane or the enemy airplane, dependent upon arguments fed into the module. Let's get started. Within the main.lua file, I've created code that instantiates the fighter through the display.newImageRect call. Here, display.newImageRect simply looks for the image, applies its proper dimensions, sets the reference point to the center, and then centers it within the display. So now, what I'll do is I'll create an airplane module that will essentially do the same thing, but will allow me to call a single line of code in the main.lua file, and then adjust the airplane itself within a different file. So I'll copy the code that instantiates and positions the fighter, and then comment it out in the main.lua file. Now we'll be switching between multiple files, so you'll want to be very careful to track which file that we're currently on. Okay, I'll save that and now create a new Lua file. With an Xcode, I do this by going to File, New File, not New Project, and choosing Other, Empty File. I'll type airplane.lua. If you're using a different text editor, such as Text Wrangler or BBEdit, simply create a new file with the .lua extension and call it airplane.lua. Now we'll choose the right project folder and save the file within that folder. I now have my airplane.lua file created. So let's get started typing some code that will allow us to instantiate our airplanes from the main.lua file. We'll type module, open and close parentheses, ... comma, package.call. This line is needed for all new modules. Now we'll create a function that allows us to instantiate the airplane. We'll use the word new. Function new, open and close parentheses, end. Within the parentheses, we'll type params. Within the function, we're going to copy the main.lua fighter code and paste it within the other function. So we're back at the airplane.lua file, and we'll paste within the new function. So referring to the function that's called new. We need to do a few more things before we can call this from the main.lua file. First of all, it's going to get confusing if we have a variable named fighter in our airplane.lua file and a variable named fighter in our main.lua file, even though these two variables are of different scopes. That is, one is scoped to the airplane.lua file and another is scoped to the main.lua project. For right now, we're going to rename the local variable within the airplane.lua file so that it doesn't get too confusing. So let's just type plane. And we have to replace all of the other fighter references. Okay, we'll save that. And now we'll create a new line. Use the return keyword, plane. What we're doing here is when we call this function called new, it creates an airplane using display new image rect. It sets the center reference point for that airplane, and then it positions the airplane on the screen. But we can't actually access the result of any of this unless we return the object here, which is called plane. Okay, we save that, go to main.lua, and now we'll type local airplane, so creating a variable called airplane, equals require, and then the name of the module file, so airplane, but without the .lua. Now I decided to call the local variable the same name as the module file because just for me that's a bit easier because I'm thinking of airplane.lua as being almost like an airplane class, though really it's a prototype for airplanes. It doesn't quite have the same functionality as a class. Okay, so now to create my fighter, underneath this line, I'll type local fighter equals airplane. Remember that this is a reference to the airplane.lua file, .new, open and close parentheses. So airplane.lua file, the function called new. Save it and go back to the Corona simulator, and I relaunch, and there is my plane up in the upper left corner. Looks like there's something wrong, so let's go back to our folder here, our file, and looks like I have a typo, not planar, plane. It should be in the center. There we go. Okay, so now I have created an airplane from an external file called airplane.lua, and to instantiate that airplane, I created a local variable that was a reference to that external module, and then I created another local variable that allowed me to call a method of that external module. Okay, so let's do a few other things here. We want to introduce some parameters that allow us to call different airplanes, and as well we can implement touch events. We don't want to necessarily introduce the touch events in the main.lua file because what we're doing is we're trying to create a paradigm whereby the main.lua file is simply object instantiation and then logic for our game or our application. What we're doing is in other files, in these modules, we are creating prototypes that allow us to define how the object will look, be positioned, have interactions, etc. within those particular modules so that we don't clutter up our main.lua unnecessarily. It doesn't really affect performance necessarily, but it can be helpful if you're working within teams, especially that somebody's working on the airplane.lua, somebody's working on the main boss.lua, or something like that. Okay, so now let's head back to airplane.lua. What we'll do is we'll introduce the params argument so that different airplanes will load depending upon parameters received. So I will type if params. So if the arguments even exist, then end. Now, if the arguments exist, let's see what the arguments are. If params.type double equals, let's say we call this one, let's call it hero instead of fighter. Then else if params.type double equals enemy, then end. So essentially, if we feed in a parameter of hero, then we want the hero airplane image. Else, if we feed enemy, we want the enemy airplane image. Okay, what we'll do is right under new params, we're going to create a variable called local img. And then we're going to use this variable within this code block here. So we'll say img equals, then the string to the hero airplane, images airplane.png. And then if it's the enemy, we will change that to enemy.png. Actually, let me double check that if it's not enemy airplane. Yeah, it's enemy airplane. Okay, so what we just did was we created a block of code that checks for params to exist. That's if params then. And if params does exist, then we're looking for params.type. And if that has a value of hero, we're going to load the image of the hero airplane. If that has the value of enemy, we're going to load the image of the enemy airplane. What we need to do is substitute down here in our code, instead of the string for new image rect, we're going to type img. When I created my assets, both of the airplanes have the same dimensions of 100 by 75. If you create assets that don't have the same dimensions, then you would go through the same process to create variables that have reference to those dimensions, especially if we're going to use a new image rect. Anyhow, so back to main.lua. Now in our airplane.new, within the parentheses, I'll type in 2 curly braces, type equals, let's say enemy, and that's a string. Save that. Make sure that our other file is saved. And now let's load it. And now we have our enemy airplane. Okay, well, let's go back to main.lua. Let's change the name of this variable to enemy. And above it, local hero equals airplane.new. And open and close the brackets. Type equals hero. Now, they're both going to be created right on top of each other, so I'm going to change the positioning after they are created. Hero dot y equals the height of the display minus the height of the hero. And enemy dot y equals the height of the display. Oh, I have division here. That should just be minus. The height of the display minus enemy.height. And actually now as I think about it, that doesn't make any sense. We should start at 0, which is the top of the display, plus the enemy height. The reason I do 0 plus enemy height is that allows me to define an offset, which is 0. So if I had an offset, it would be offset plus the height of the object. Okay, save it, go back to the simulator, and there we have our hero and our enemy. Of course, it makes sense to rotate the enemy so that it faces the hero, so that they can be in battle. If I'm always going to have the enemy rotated, well, I could go into Photoshop, rotate the plane, save it, and that would be fine. But you know, that actually isn't the most flexible way. Instead, what I'll do is go back to the airplane.lua file, and I'm going to introduce some code that allows me to test for the params.type equals enemy and introduce some rotation. Okay, so this block of code here instantiates the airplane. So now, if params, then end. So do the params exist? If params.type double equals enemy, then n. Plane.rotation equals 180. Okay. If the desired airplane is an enemy airplane, rotate the image 180 degrees. I think that's a degree symbol. Okay. So now let's go back to the simulator, and there you go. Let's go a little bit further before we end the lesson. We're going to implement touch listeners, and we could do that in the main.lua file, but as well we could do it within the airplane.lua file. That allows us to define touch listeners for every single prototype airplane that we create. To do this, we'll go to Window, and then find our external modules file. Sorry, that was me working within Xcode. And now right before we return the object, let's type plain : add event listener, and open and close parentheses, listen for the touch event, comma, plain. So we're going to call the method on itself. Now, function plain : touch, open and close, and type in E, end. All right. So now, again, we can test for the params. Okay, let me make this a little larger. And we can utilize that within the plain touch function. So if e.phase double equal, let's say ended, that needs to be a string. Then, now, if params exists, then we need to do, I'll copy this from above. We'll do different implementations based on if we are creating a hero airplane or an enemy airplane. Okay. So I just copied from the code block above, it's a little bit faster. So let's say if it's a hero airplane, print I'm the hero. And if it's an enemy airplane, print I'm the enemy. Okay, one thing that might make sense here is if you have different projectiles that are coming out of the airplanes, different bullets or missiles, which I'm not going to go into in this particular lesson, but in a future game we'll certainly look at how to implement projectiles from these prototypes, depending on what kind of prototypes they are. Anyhow, so I save, go back to main.lua, and let's relaunch the simulator and bring up the terminal. Okay, clear the terminal window. So when I click on the airplane, on the hero, I'm the hero, and if I click on the enemy, I'm the enemy. So you can begin to see how with this single code contained within airplane.lua, we can define a prototype of a single object. I'll use the word loosely, class. It's essentially a class of airplanes. It could be heroes, enemies. You could imagine that we could implement boss enemies or special power-ups for the hero. All of those things are a bit more complicated and require some planning in your data model for the airplane. But for right now, we have a simple method within airplane.lua called new. New accepts arguments in the form of, here we call it params, you could call it args or whatever you want. And then depending on those params, we're loading a hero airplane, and here that's assigning the string to the hero airplane that is then fed into this line, which loads a new image rect with that string. And we've also defined some different interactivity depending on touch, so that if the touch received on the hero airplane or is received on the hero airplane, we'll print one option, and you could insert a lot of different code here. And if it's on the enemy airplane, we will do something else. And I think more importantly for me is that the main.lua file now has in 4 lines a lot of code that isn't necessary to see in your logic layer. That is the layer where you're going to implement how the game actually functions. What we started with were 3 lines just to instantiate the airplane, and now that's accomplished in 1. To call the module, we need to use the require statement and call the front part of the file name. It's called airplane.lua, so we just type airplane and make sure that that file is in the same folder as the main.lua file. I've created an airplane variable, which essentially in this line of code takes the entire contents of airplane.lua and sets it into the airplane variable. That allows me to then call methods from airplane.lua by utilizing the newly created variable and then using dot syntax and the method here, new. It's a lot to take in for sure, but we will be utilizing modules from here on out, and it just takes some practice to get used to, but you'll find yourself coding much more sanely and in an organized fashion when you use external modules with the Corona SDK.